Dust hung in the air over Kasserine Pass, like the smoke of a funeral pyre that refused to die. Late February 1943, Tunisia. The moment the United States Army looked into the mirror of modern mechanized war and flinched. It wasn't a graceful defeat. It was disintegration. M4 Sherman tanks, fresh from American factories, sat abandoned on the rocky plain with engines still ticking heat, turrets traversed halfway, main guns unfired. Crews had bailed out when the first 88mm shells cracked the sky. Some left the hatches open as if inviting inspection. Others slammed them shut and ran. Infantry regiments, many still wearing the shoulder patches of National Guard units from Iowa, Illinois, Pennsylvania, melted away under the weight of German Panzer Grenadiers advancing behind Mark IVs and the new long-barreled Panthers. Men threw away helmets, rifles, packs. They fled through the same dry wadis their fathers had crossed in 1918, only now the enemy had Stukas, half-tracks, and 3 years of unbroken battlefield experience. German newsreel crews set up tripods on the ridgelines. They filmed long columns of American prisoners marching west under guard, heads down, hands on helmets, faces the color of old canvas. The footage would play in Berlin theaters within days, narrated in clipped triumph. See how the vaunted arsenal of democracy collapses when tested. At the forward command post of 2 Corps, 20 miles behind the line in a cave system carved into the rock at Tebessa, Major General Lloyd R. Fredendall presided over catastrophe from 3 stories underground. The bunker had been excavated by Army engineers at his personal insistence. Deep enough, he said, to survive even the heaviest bombing. It was lit by strings of bare bulbs. Telephone lines snaked across the floor like exposed veins. Fredendall rarely left his cot. He issued orders over the phone in the tone of a man dictating to a secretary, rather than directing men to their deaths. "Tell them to hold the line out there," he would say. Out there was how he referred to the battlefield 20 miles away, a place he had never visited. When staff officers pressed for clarity, where exactly should the 1st Armored Division counterattack? What was the current disposition of the 168th Infantry? Fredendall grew irritated. "I gave the orders. They'll figure it out." They did not figure it out. The casualty reports arrived in bundles wrapped in brown paper. Nearly 6,000 Americans killed, wounded, or missing in 6 days. An entire combat command of the 1st Armored Division encircled and destroyed. 2 battalions of the 34th Infantry Division, Midwestern farm boys who had trained together since 1939, surrounded on a barren hilltop called Hill 409 and annihilated almost to a man. Survivors later said the German artillery came down so precisely it felt personal. In Algiers, Dwight D. Eisenhower read the dispatches at 3:17 a.m. on February 25th. He sat alone in the villa that served as Allied Force headquarters, the room lit only by a green-shaded desk lamp. The casualty figures stared back at him like an accusation. The British had already begun to whisper in staff cars and officers' messes. Perhaps the Americans were not ready for this war. Perhaps they never would be. Churchill had cabled privately, "We must be careful not to allow the Americans to become discouraged." The subtext was unmistakable. Discouragement could become withdrawal. Eisenhower knew the stakes were larger than Tunisia. If 2 Corps collapsed again, if American forces proved incapable of holding ground against a determined enemy, the political bargain that held the Anglo-American alliance together would begin to fray. Washington would question the cost. London would press for greater control of future operations. The entire strategy for invading Europe would be in doubt. There was only one officer in theater who might stop the bleeding before it became fatal. George S. Patton, Jr. had spent the winter in Morocco, commanding I Armored Corps, a formation that existed more on paper than in the field. He had drilled his men relentlessly, screamed at officers until veins stood out on his forehead, and written long letters to his wife Beatrice about the maddening slowness of war. He had studied the Kasserine reports with the intensity of a man reading his own obituary. He believed, fiercely, religiously, that armies won through confidence, and confidence was enforced through accountability. He also believed that the reputation of the entire United States Army, and perhaps its future in the war, now rested on this single shattered corps. On March 6, 1943, a command car bearing 3 stars rolled through the wire perimeter of Sec Corps headquarters at Jebel el Guessa. The vehicle stopped in a cloud of red dust. Patton stepped out wearing mirror-shined cavalry boots, ivory-handled .45s in low-slung holsters, a lacquered helmet with 3 stars gleaming, and an expression that made staff officers feel suddenly naked. He wore no overcoat despite the morning chill. He did not need one. The cold, like shrapnel, was for other men. He walked the headquarters without a word. Officers snapped to attention in hallways. Maps were studied in silence. Patton noted everything: the absence of field dust on boots, the softness of hands that had not held binoculars for hours, the way men glanced at their watches instead of letting their watches measure time for them. He entered Fredendall's underground command post at 14:30 hours. The general rose from his cot. Patton did not extend a hand. "You're relieved," Patton said, voice flat as a bayonet. Fredendall blinked. "I beg your pardon, General." "You heard me. Pack your personal gear. You're on the next transport to Algiers. Tell the sentries outside, I want your staff car ready in 10 minutes. There was no court-martial, no formal inquiry, no appeal, just the sentence, delivered in the tone of a man signing a receipt. Fredendall stood motionless for perhaps 10 seconds. Then he nodded once, turned, and began gathering papers from the desk. His aides moved like ghosts, folding uniforms, stacking maps, packing the personal effects of a career that had just ended without ceremony. By 1600 hours the staff car was gone, headlights slicing through the afternoon dust toward the airstrip. Patton did not summon a conference. He did not deliver a speech. He simply resumed walking the headquarters, this time with intent. He stopped first in the G3 operations room. A lieutenant colonel stood before the situation map, pointer in hand, explaining troop dispositions to 2 majors. Patton listened for 30 seconds. Then he interrupted. "Where is the right flank battalion of Combat Command B, 1st Armored Division, at this moment?" The colonel cleared his throat. "Sir, the last report we received." "I didn't ask for the last report. I asked where they are right now." The colonel swallowed. I'll have to check, General." Patton's voice dropped to the register men would later call quiet thunder. "You will check in the next 60 seconds, Colonel? Or you will check out of this headquarters permanently. Go." The man left at a near run. Patton turned to the nearest major. The officer's uniform was clean, pressed, without a trace of dirt. No helmet on the desk. Garrison cap instead. "Why are you not wearing your helmet, Major?" "Sir, we're indoors." Patton reached out, plucked the garrison cap from the major's head, and dropped it on the floor. "Helmets are worn outside. Inside, when the commanding general enters, you wear the helmet of your profession, attention and competence. You are wearing neither. You are relieved. Leave the building. Do not return." The major stood frozen. Patton was already moving to the next desk. By nightfall, 7 officers had been relieved. 3 battalion commanders, 2 regimental executive officers, a division intelligence officer who could not produce current enemy dispositions from memory. Each man was given 5 minutes to collect personal belongings, then escorted to the motor pool. No salutes, no handshakes, just the crunch of gravel under boots and the low cough of engines starting in the dark. In the officers' mess that evening, men ate in near silence. Forks scraped plates mechanically. Eyes stayed down. Every time the door opened, heads turned. Every time a Jeep engine growled up the track, conversation stopped mid-sentence. A young captain, a tanker who had survived the retreat from Kasserine, leaned toward the lieutenant across from him. "They're not firing us for being cowards," he whispered. "They're firing us for being absent." The lieutenant nodded once. "Absent from the men, absent from the fight, absent from ourselves." Outside, the North African night settled cold and clear. Stars burned above the mountains where men had died only weeks before. Inside the headquarters, the corridors had never been so quiet. And in those quiet corridors, every officer understood the war had finally found them. The first 24 hours after Patton's arrival were not chaos. They were something colder. Clarity arriving like a blade. Dawn on March 7th broke gray and hard across the Tunisian steppe. Headquarters at Jebel El Gessa had barely slept. Officers who had once lingered over coffee now moved with the quick, mechanical urgency of men who knew judgment could arrive at any second. The sound of Jeep engines had become the new réveil. Every vehicle that approached the wire perimeter caused heads to turn, forks to pause midair, conversations to die in half-sentence. Patton did not announce a schedule. He had none. He inspected when he felt like inspecting. 400, 0900, 1400, midnight. He appeared without warning, boots clicking on concrete floors, ivory-handled pistols swaying at his hips like metronomes counting down to sentence. He began with the motor pools. At 05:30, he walked the tank park of the 1st Armored Division. Crews were still rubbing sleep from their eyes when he stopped beside a Sherman whose track tension looked suspiciously slack. The driver, a corporal from Ohio, snapped to attention. Patton ran a gloved hand along the track guard, then turned to the battalion commander standing nearby, a lieutenant colonel named Harlan who had commanded the unit since the landings in November. "Colonel Harlan, why is this tank not combat ready?" Harlan cleared his throat. "Sir, we've had maintenance issues. Parts are." "I didn't ask for excuses. I asked why this tank is not combat ready." Harlan's jaw worked once, twice. "We're working on it, General." Patton's gaze moved from the tank to Harlan's boots. They were polished, too polished, no dust, no field stain. "You haven't been forward with your battalion in 3 days, have you?" Harlan hesitated. That hesitation was fatal. "You are relieved. Report to the rear echelon adjutant for reassignment. Your executive officer is now in command, effective immediately." Harlan stood rigid for a long second, then saluted, turned on his heel, and walked away without another word. The tank crew watched in silence as their commander disappeared between the rows of Shermans. No one spoke until Patton had moved on to the next vehicle. By noon, the pattern was established. Patton did not shout, he did not threaten. He asked questions, precise, factual, unanswerable, and when the answers failed, he relieved. No ceremony, no paperwork, in triplicate. Just the sentence, delivered in a voice that carried no anger, only finality. Word raced through the corps faster than any field telephone. Officers began to migrate forward. Battalion commanders, who had spent weeks in the rear echelon, suddenly appeared at company command posts. Regimental commanders who had directed from map tables now stood on ridgelines with binoculars. Staff officers who had never left headquarters found themselves riding shotgun in jeeps headed toward the line. Fear mutated. It began as shock, disbelief that Fredendall's comfortable regime could end so abruptly. It became anxiety, the constant scanning of horizons for approaching dust plumes. By the second day, it had deepened into something existential. The understanding that rank no longer protected you. Intention no longer counted. Only presence counted. Only answers counted. Only performance. In the operations tent that evening, Patton stood before the main situation map, while a harried major tried to brief him on the latest dispositions. Halfway through the presentation, Patton interrupted. "Major, where is the commanding officer of the 168th Infantry Regiment right now?" The major blinked. "I believe he's at his forward CP, sir." "Do you believe?" Patton turned to Omar Bradley, who had arrived that morning as Patton's deputy commander. Bradley stood quietly in the corner, arms folded, watching everything with the careful eyes of a man who measured consequences before he spoke. "General Bradley," Patton said without turning, "would you kindly find out where Colonel Ryder actually is? I would like an answer in less than 5 minutes." Bradley nodded once and left the tent. He returned in 4 minutes. "Colonel Ryder is at his regimental CP, approximately 8 miles forward. He's been there since 0600. Patton nodded almost imperceptibly. "Thank you, General Bradley. Major, you are dismissed. You will report to me tomorrow morning at 0700 with the exact location of every battalion commander in this corps. If you cannot produce that list from memory, do not bother reporting." The major left without saluting. His face was the color of wet ash. Later that night, in the small command trailer Patton had commandeered, Bradley found him studying terrain photographs under a single bulb. The general was still in full uniform, boots on, pistols within reach. Bradley spoke carefully. "You're moving fast, George." "I'm moving at the speed the Germans move," Patton replied without looking up. "If we're slower, we die." Bradley waited a beat. "Some of the men you're relieving aren't cowards. They're just unready. They got here before the war taught them what it wanted." Patton finally looked at him. The lamplight carved deep shadows under his eyes. "Then they should have learned faster," he said. "Or they should step aside for men who will." Bradley did not argue. He had seen Kasserine. He had seen the abandoned tanks, the empty foxholes, the prisoners shuffling past German cameras. He knew the price of unreadiness. He also knew the price of ruthlessness. Some of them will never recover from this, Bradley said quietly. Their careers end tonight, in silence, before they ever get a chance to prove themselves. Patton's expression did not change. Then they should have proven themselves yesterday. Outside the trailer, the wind rose. Somewhere in the darkness a jeep engine started, then died, then started again. Another officer heading forward, trying to outrun the next inspection. Inside headquarters buildings, men who had slept in cots now slept in the open, closer to their units. Battalion commanders who had once eaten in the officers' mess now ate C rations with their companies. Staff officers who had once briefed from memory now carried notebooks filled with exact locations, times, and names. Helmets were worn constantly. Boots were dusty again. Hands were no longer soft. Fear had done its first work. It had made men move. But movement alone was not enough. Patton knew that. Fear could scatter men. Only disciplined fear could make them fight. At 200 on March 8th, he summoned the remaining division commanders to his trailer. They arrived rumpled, eyes red, uniforms bearing fresh field dust. Patton stood before them without preamble. Gentlemen, this corps will no longer be commanded from the rear. Leadership will be visible. Commanders will be where their men can see them. If you cannot be seen, you will not be needed. If you hesitate, you will be replaced. If you fail to answer my questions, you will be gone before breakfast. He paused, letting the silence fill the small space. I am not interested in intentions. I am not interested in explanations. I am interested in results. Results are produced by men who are present, decisive, and aggressive. If you are not those things, step aside now. I will not wait for the Germans to teach you. No one spoke. Patton continued. Tomorrow morning we begin daily forward inspections. I expect every commander to know exactly where his men are, what they need, and what they intend to do about the enemy in the next 24 hours. If you cannot answer those questions, do not wait for me to ask them. Resign your command before I arrive. The meeting ended at 2:30. The generals filed out into the night. None of them returned to their former headquarters that evening. They went straight to their forward command posts. In the operations room, the night duty officer, a young captain who had survived Kasserine, watched the exodus through the tent flap. He turned to the sergeant beside him. They're not running from Patton, he said softly. They're running toward the war. The sergeant nodded. About damn time. Outside, another jeep engine coughed to life. Headlights cut the darkness. Another commander heading forward, helmet on, map case in hand, fear now sharpening into something useful. Leadership was no longer a title, it was a daily test of survival. By March 10th, the fear had begun to crystallize. It no longer paralyzed, it focused. Headquarters at Jebel Gessa had transformed in 4 days. The underground bunker once occupied by Fredendall now stood half empty. Many of its desks abandoned, maps rolled up, telephones silent. The men who remained worked with a new, almost feverish precision. Papers were no longer scattered. They were filed by hour and unit. Situation overlays were updated every 90 minutes. Officers who once spoke in vague estimates now gave grid coordinates, exact times, and named subordinates. Patton had moved his own command post forward. He slept in a tent pitched beside the main road to Gafsa, within earshot of artillery. He ate standing at a folding table. He inspected at dawn, noon, and dusk, always unannounced, always moving. The reliefs continued, but now they were surgical rather than sweeping. Patton had shifted from wholesale purges to targeted replacements. He no longer simply removed, he promoted from below. On the morning of March 9th, he stood on a low ridge overlooking the sector held by the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one. Below him, infantry companies were digging in under the supervision of captains and first sergeants. The division commander, Major General Terry Allen, had already survived 2 inspections by staying visible, sleeping with his troops, and answering every question with facts instead of apologies. Patton watched for 10 minutes without speaking. Then he turned to Bradley, who had become his constant shadow. Allen stays, Patton said quietly. He gets it. Bradley nodded. He's rough, he swears at colonels in front of privates, but he's always where the bullets are going to land. That's the new standard, Patton replied. Rough is acceptable. Absent is not. That afternoon, Patton relieved another regimental commander, this one from the 9th Infantry Division, who had positioned his command post 3 miles behind the forward line to maintain communications. Patton arrived in a cloud of dust, asked 3 questions, received 3 equivocations, and pronounced sentence in less than 90 seconds. The man's executive officer, a lieutenant colonel named Paul Harkins, was standing nearby. "Colonel Harkins," Patton said, "you are now regimental commander, effective immediately. Get your headquarters forward by 1800 hours tonight, or you will join your predecessor on the next plane out." Harkins saluted. "Yes, sir." He moved without hesitation. By 1700, his new command post was established 800 yards behind the forward companies, close enough to hear rifle fire, far enough not to draw direct artillery. It was the new normal. Promotions rippled outward like shockwaves. Captains became majors overnight. Majors became lieutenant colonels. Battalion commanders who had been in place for months were suddenly replaced by younger, hungrier men who had been company commanders at Kasserine and who had refused to run. One such promotion became legend within days. Captain James Van Fleet, a battalion executive officer in the 18th Infantry, had personally led a counterattack at Kasserine when his battalion commander froze. He had lost 2 companies, but he had held the pass long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Patton had heard the story secondhand. On March 10th, he summoned Van Fleet to his tent. Van Fleet arrived covered in dust, helmet strap still fastened, eyes bloodshot from 3 days without sleep. Patton looked him over like a man appraising horseflesh. "I hear you don't run, Captain." "I try not to, sir." Patton smiled, a rare, thin thing. "You now command the 18th Infantry Regiment. Get your headquarters where I can see it from the road." Dismissed. Van Fleet saluted, turned, and walked out. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply moved. Omar Bradley watched the exchange from the corner of the tent. Later, when they were alone, he spoke. "You're building an army of strangers, George. The men who knew the old ways are gone. The ones who remain are the ones who learned under fire, and under you." Patton lit a cigar, exhaled slowly. "The old ways lost us, Kasserine. I'll take strangers who fight over friends who run." Bradley did not disagree. He had spent the last week observing the change. Officers who once hid in headquarters now walked the lines at night. They knew the names of their platoon sergeants. They knew which squads had lost their bars. They knew exactly where the German lines were probing. Discipline was hardening into identity. Training began in earnest, not parade ground drill, but live fire exercises under simulated conditions. Patton ordered night maneuvers, forced marches, anti-tank drills with live ammunition. He wanted men to feel the weight of their own weapons, to hear the crack of bullets overhead, to understand that hesitation killed faster than the enemy. He also enforced visibility as doctrine. Every commander above battalion level was required to visit his forward positions at least twice daily. Patton himself set the example. He drove the roads in an open command car, red light mounted on the fender, flags snapping. Soldiers began to recognize the silhouette. The shiny helmet, the pistols, the hard-eyed stare. When the jeep passed, men straightened instinctively, not out of fear anymore, out of something closer to pride. In the foxholes, enlisted men absorbed the lesson silently. Private First Class Eddie Slovic of the 28th Infantry watched a new battalion commander, a man who had been a company commander 2 days earlier, walk the line at dusk, checking ammunition, asking questions, listening to answers. The new CO stayed until full dark, then walked back to his jeep under starlight. Slovic turned to the man beside him in the hole. "They're finally in it with us," he said. The other soldier nodded. "About damn time." The transformation was not complete. Doubt still lingered in quiet moments. Some of the relieved officers had been competent men, simply men who had arrived too early in a war that had not yet taught its lessons. Their replacements were often rough-edged, impulsive, imperfect, but they were present, they were aggressive, they were visible. And visibility, Patton believed, was the first step toward belief. Bradley continued his quiet evaluation. He wrote no reports yet. Eisenhower had given him latitude. Observe, advise, report only when necessary. Bradley understood the unspoken instruction. If Patton's methods worked, they would be adopted. If they failed, The blame would fall on the man who had wielded the knife. On the evening of March 11th, Patton stood on a ridge overlooking the entire core sector. The sun was setting behind the Atlas Mountains, turning the plain the color of old blood. Below him, campfires flickered where they had never been allowed before. Small, disciplined fires, just enough to heat coffee and sea rations. Men moved between positions. Officers walked the lines. Jeeps crawled the roads, headlights hooded. Patton turned to Bradley. "They're starting to believe they belong here," he said. Bradley watched the same scene. "They're starting to believe they can win." The army had not yet won, but it no longer believed it deserved to lose. March 23, 1943. Dawn over the plain south of Guettar. The sky was still the color of bruised steel when the first German reconnaissance aircraft droned high overhead. American anti-aircraft gunners tracked it but held fire. Orders were strict. Do not reveal positions until the main blow landed. Below the ridgeline, the 1st Infantry Division and elements of the 1st Armored Division waited in prepared positions. Foxholes had been dug deep, slit trenches zigzagged between them, anti-tank guns sighted with interlocking fields of fire. Artillery batteries had registered targets the previous afternoon. Forward observers now crouched in observation posts with maps marked in red grease pencil and telephones ready. For the first time since the landings in North Africa, the American line looked like a line. Coherent, deliberate, manned by soldiers who knew exactly where their neighbors were and what they were supposed to do. Patton had spent the night moving between command posts. He had slept perhaps 2 hours in the back of his command car, parked beside the 1st Armored's forward headquarters. At 4:30, he was awake, helmet on, pistols holstered, studying the latest aerial photographs. He spoke little. He listened. At 500, the German attack began. Rommel's Afrika Corps, now under von Arnim's command, had decided to strike before the Americans could consolidate after their recent gains. The plan was classic German. Panzer spearhead through the center, supported by artillery and infantry on the flanks, aimed at cutting the road to Gafsa and rolling up the American right. First came the artillery. Heavy 150mm howitzers opened from concealed positions in the hills east of Guettar. Shells walked across the plain in methodical brackets, searching for American gun positions. Dust plumes rose like geysers. Men pressed themselves into the earth. Then the panzers appeared. Mark IIIs and Mark IVs with long 75mm guns rolled forward in staggered waves, dust boiling behind their tracks. Behind them, half-tracks carried panzer grenadiers. The Germans advanced with the confidence of men who had broken better armies than this one. They did not know the Americans had changed. The first contact came at 0530. A company of Shermans from Combat Command A, 1st Armored, positioned hull down behind a low rise, waited until the lead German tanks were within 1,200 yards. Then the American commander, a major promoted 8 days earlier, gave the order, fire. The 75mm guns cracked in near unison. The lead Mark IV slewed sideways, turret ring hit, smoke pouring from the engine deck. A second tank took a solid hit to the track and slewed to a stop. The German formation hesitated, only for seconds, but seconds were enough. American artillery answered. Forward observers had been watching since first light. The coordinates were already dialed in. 105mm and 155mm howitzers opened with time-on-target concentrations. Shells arrived together in a single, shattering roar. German infantry dismounted under fire. Half-tracks burned. The advance slowed. On the infantry line, the 18th Infantry Regiment, now commanded by the newly promoted Colonel Van Fleet, held firm. Men who had run at Kasserine now lay behind their rifles and bars, waiting. When the Panzer Grenadiers advanced behind the surviving tanks, the Americans opened fire with disciplined bursts. Grenades arced out. Machine guns chattered in long, controlled rips. The German assault wave broke against barbed wire and interlocking fire. Patton watched from an observation post on a low hill behind the center. Bradley stood beside him, binoculars steady. "They're not falling back," Bradley said quietly. "They're not supposed to," Patton replied. At 700, the Germans committed their reserves. Another battalion of Mark IVs swinging south to outflank the American left. The move was textbook. It should have worked. It did not. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion had been positioned exactly where Patton had ordered. Hull down, camouflaged, with clear fields of fire across the expected avenue. Their 75mm guns on half-tracks were lighter, faster, and, crucially, manned by crews who had drilled relentlessly for 3 days under threat of relief. The tank destroyers opened fire at 800 yards. German tanks began to brew up. The Panzer commander tried to maneuver, but American artillery walked fire across his formation. The flanking attack dissolved into smoke and confusion. By 900, the German assault had spent itself. Burning hulks dotted the plain. Survivors withdrew under covering fire, dragging wounded, leaving equipment behind. For the first time in the Tunisian campaign, an American formation had met a determined German armored attack, and held. Patton lowered his binoculars. His face showed no triumph, only the tight satisfaction of a man who had seen a calculation prove correct. Bradley spoke first. They stood. They did more than stand, Patton said. They answered fire with fire. They answered steel with steel. In the aftermath, the plain was littered with the wreckage of German armor. 26 tanks destroyed or damaged beyond repair, according to later counts. American losses were significant. Tanks burned, infantry casualties, but the line had not broken. No units had abandoned positions. No commanders had ordered retreat. Men climbed out of foxholes, faces black with powder smoke, eyes wide with the realization that they had not run. A sergeant in the 18th Infantry looked at the burning Panzer 600 yards away and turned to his platoon leader, a lieutenant who had been a sergeant 2 weeks earlier. "We held them, sir." The lieutenant nodded once. "We did." In the command post later that afternoon, Patton walked among the staff officers who had survived the purges. Maps were updated in real time. Reports came in crisp, accurate, without hesitation. Omar Bradley stood at the back, watching Patton move from desk to desk. "You were right," Bradley said when they were alone. "Fear made them move. Discipline made them hold." Patton lit a cigar. Fear got them out of their holes. Belief kept them there. Bradley did not reply immediately. He thought of the relieved officers now scattered across rear echelons, men whose names would disappear from the official histories. He thought of the promoted captains and majors who had just proven themselves under fire. He thought of the cost. The quiet, invisible cost of turning an army inside out in 10 days. Outside, the sun dropped toward the horizon. Smoke still rose from the battlefield. American soldiers moved among the dead and the damaged equipment, collecting weapons, tending wounded, beginning the long work of consolidation. They had not yet won the war. They had not yet won Tunisia. But on this day, at El Guettar, for the first time, the American army had met the enemy in open combat, and had not run. This time, they did not run. The dust of El Guettar settled slowly, like regret. By the afternoon of March 24, 1943, the plain south of the oasis was already being cleared. Wrecked Mark IVs and burned-out half-tracks were towed to salvage points. American dead were wrapped in shelter halves and carried to the rear under white flags of truce. German prisoners, fewer than expected, marched west in long silent columns, heads down, the shock of reversal still visible in their posture. At 2 Corps forward headquarters, a cluster of tents and radio vans now pushed well ahead of the old bunker at Jebel el Gessa, Patton walked the perimeter at dusk. He carried no map, he needed none. He knew every ridge, every wadi, every position his men had held that morning. Soldiers snapped to attention as he passed. Some saluted. Many simply nodded, the small, hard nod of men who have just discovered they can stand against something that once broke them. The victory was modest by later standards. El Guettar did not end the North African campaign. It did not capture Tunis. It did not even destroy the Africa Corps. But it did something more permanent. It proved to the men who had run at Kasserine, to the officers who had watched them run, to the generals in Algiers and Washington, that the American army could hold ground under fire, answer steel with steel, and remain a coherent fighting formation when the moment came. The cost ledger was kept quietly. In the days that followed, the reliefs tapered off. Patton no longer needed to fire men to make a point. The point had been made. The officers who remained were the ones who had adapted fastest, or the ones who had been promoted into the vacuum left by those who could not. Careers that ended in March 1943 did so without fanfare. There were no courts-martial, no public disgrace, just a quiet order to report to the replacement depot in Oran, followed by reassignment to stateside training commands, quartermaster depots, or the long gray limbo of special duty. Many of the relieved men never saw combat again. Their names faded from unit histories, replaced by the names of men who had been captains on March 5th and lieutenant colonels by March 25th. The system Patton had improvised became doctrine. By April, the War Department had quietly circulated a new policy. Commanders at every level were to be evaluated continuously on performance, not tenure. Relief for cause was to be swift, unapologetic, and without appeal unless directly countermanded by theater commander. The practice spread. It reached Sicily that summer, Italy the next year, and finally Western Europe. The American army that landed in Normandy in 1944 was an army that expected its leaders to be visible, decisive, and replaceable. It was an army that no longer confused rank with immunity. And yet the transformation left scars. Some of the promoted men proved brittle under later strain. Aggression without wisdom is a liability. Visibility without judgment is a target. A few of the men Patton had elevated rose rapidly and fell just as fast when their recklessness outran their competence. Others became the backbone of future divisions. The system did not guarantee excellence. It guaranteed accountability. Excellence remained the gamble. Omar Bradley, who had observed every step of the 10-day crucible, later wrote in private notes never intended for publication. Patton did not rebuild the army through inspiration. He rebuilt it through the fear of being found wanting. That fear became institutional. It outlived him. It outlived the war. Eisenhower never publicly questioned the methods. Privately, he told Marshall that the changes in Sick Corps had been brutal, necessary, and effective. He did not use the word merciful. Patton himself said little about the 10 days afterward. In letters to Beatrice, he wrote about the new spirit of the troops, the sharpness of their salutes, the way men now looked him in the eye instead of at the ground. He did not write about the officers he had erased. He did not need to. The silence was the monument. The army that emerged from Tunisia was harder, colder, more ruthless toward its own failures. It was also more effective. Whether that trade was just remained an open question, one that historians, veterans, and the relieved men themselves would argue over for decades. In the foxholes of later campaigns, soldiers would sometimes speak of the Kasserine lesson. It was not a lesson about tactics. It was a lesson about consequence. Fail, and you will be replaced. Hesitate, and you will be gone. Stand and fight, and you might survive to be replaced another day. The system Patton helped forge would eventually turn on him. In the autumn of 1945, after slapping 2 shell-shocked soldiers in Sicily and speaking too freely about post-war policy, he would find himself relieved of command, sidelined, and reduced to a figure of controversy. The same mechanism he had wielded so ruthlessly, swift, unappealable removal for perceived failure, would be used against him. He would die in December 1945, after a low-speed car accident, still believing the army he had remade was worth the price. Whether it was worth the price is the question that remains. Armies are not reborn through mercy. Accountability reshapes institutions long after battles end. Victory often begins with careers ending in silence. Patton did not rebuild the U.S. Army. He forced it to decide what it would become, and it decided. Subscribe for more moments when history reveals how power truly works.